In this video, we're going to take a look at basic fuel injection systems. So, really, in a perfect world, if we could inject the proper amount of fuel, have the proper amount of air, we would end up with water and carbon dioxide coming out the exhaust pipe. But it doesn't happen that way because loads change, engine performance changes. So we have a lot of byproducts. But what we want to do is inject the right amount of fuel for the right amount of air under the right amount of conditions so that we get the best burn that we can. We get the most efficient use of that fuel and turn that into power for running the engine. So a couple things we need to know. So timing, injecting the fuel at the correct time, not too early, not too late. Um, the rate is injecting the fuel at the correct ratio so that we're not overfueling or underfueling. Atomization is atomizing the fuel for proper combustion. So again, we want the droplets as small as possible so that they can absorb the heat faster and turn from a liquid to a vapor. Metering the fuel to meet what the engine needs, again, so we're not overfueling or underfueling. And penetration, so injecting the fuel at a high enough pressure to penetrate into the combustion chamber. And what we talked about earlier is once that fuel is injected with the swirling action inside that piston, we want to be able to mix that fuel properly with the air. We don't want it all on one side or it may not burn. It may not be able to absorb all the heat enough. So we want the penetration in there so all of that fuel can be turned into a vapor and then ignited. So the phases of combustion. So the first phase begins with the ignition delay period. So when we first inject that fuel in, it's injected as a liquid. Now, as the piston's coming from bottom dead center, top dead center, and compressing the air that's in there, the air heats up. We also have heat from the cylinder walls or the engine itself. And what has to happen is that liquid has to turn into a vapor. And again, if you remember earlier, we talked about what is the vapor point or the fire point. Well, that fuel has to vaporize so it will self-ignite because there's no spark in a diesel engine. So there's a delay period. So that's that interval between the beginning of injection and the point of ignition. The second phase involves the flame spread. So it'll start at one point wherever that fuel gets to the point where it will ignite. Then that flame will spread, will propagate out. Immediately after the ignition sequence starts, flame propagation through the cylinder starts and spreads very rapidly, igniting the heavier air mixture vapors. Now, we talked about lighter and heavier components of diesel fuel. So if diesel fuel sits for a long time, the lighter ends leave. So it's harder to ignite that than it is uh, diesel fuel with the lighter ends in it. So as the lighter ends ignite, the heat from those lighter ends is going to ignite the heavier ends and we get a complete burn. So at that point, the temperature and the pressure drastically rises. As the pressure rise reaches its maximum, it starts to flatten out and decline very quickly. So, and at that point, almost all the fuel is burnt. Now, ignition takes place at different points in an engine. We'll discuss that a little bit later. So the third phase of combustion is controlled by the rate and timing of the fuel delivered to the cylinder. And again, it all depends on what we have for engine load and the requirements. So for instance, if I have an engine on high idle, the fuel is very low, the quantity that's injected. But if I'm under full load, even though the RPM is the same as no load, I require a lot more fuel. So afterburn is not really considered a phase, but it is there. Anything that's unburned just goes out the exhaust pipe. So for instance, if I have a very cold engine when I start in the morning, because the heavier ends can't reach the temperature to vaporize and ignite, they'll just go out the exhaust pipe. So if you look at an old mechanical injection pump, uh, we start out on a cold day, we get a lot of white smoke and we could smell the diesel in the air. And that's because those are the heavier ends that just can't get to the vapor point. So this is a graph that shows as it starts to climb up, we get our different phases. So timing of the injection is really important. So if we take a look at what are the optimum crank angles. So again, we know what bottom dead center is, top dead center, before top dead center, after top dead center. So what we want to do is we want to complete the combustion process at a certain point in the engine under all phases. And that's one of the reasons why we advance the timing or retard the timing on an engine, is so that our combustion process is always finished at the same point. Let's just say it's 25 degrees after top dead center is when we want the combustion process to end. Now, that doesn't mean that the pressure's gone or the fuel's all burnt, but that's when our process ends. Now, if we inject it too late, we lose power. If we inject it too early, we lose power. So we got to inject it at the right point. So again, timing occurs after manufacturer specifications when timing is retarded, and if it's advanced, it's before the manufacturer's recommendation. So we should always make sure that on mechanical systems that injection takes place the proper time. When we take a look at computerized systems, the computer controls when injection is going to happen, how much is going to be injected. So advancing the timing, again, why do we want to advance the timing? Well, as an engine speeds up, fuel has a certain amount of time that it takes to burn a quantity of fuel. That will never change. If we didn't advance the timing, that period of time as we increase the RPM would be shorter. So instead of finishing at 25 degrees, we might finish at 30, 35, 40 degrees. And at that, after top dead center, and at that point, we've lost the power in that fuel to do anything for the engine. So by advancing the timing, the time that the fuel finishes the burn is always the same. Again, let's say 25 degrees before top dead center. Now, when do we get the most power out of, or when does ignition begin? Well, usually, again, we want the most power in that engine is about 3 degrees before top dead center, because the momentum is going to carry it over, and then we have the most amount of power available for us. So if we take a look at how diesel fuel is injected, it is injected as a liquid, even though it is a fine, fine droplets, it's still a liquid. And again, that liquid has to turn into a vapor in order to be in order to ignite. Now there's lots of different types of fuel systems that are out there, and we're going to go through a bunch of different ones. So there's a port and helix metering system. There's a PT fuel system. There's an opposing plunger and an inlet metering type fuel system. There's a sleeve metering type fuel system, and then we get into the electronic fuel systems. So we talked about the penetration of fuel, and again, making sure that all that fuel is spread evenly throughout over top of that whole piston area, so we get a complete burn. We've already taken a look at basic fuel systems from the fuel tank up to the injection pump. Then we're going to take a look at how injection pumps are set up. For instance, this one here, the whole unit is gear driven. It's timed to the engine, so injection timing is set up for each of the cylinders. And then we have a return line for any fuel that isn't used or is too warm, also out of the injector. Anything that leaks past the injector goes back to the return side. We get some systems that are set up where all the injectors are in the head, and it's the plunger moving up and down that injects the fuel compared to this one here, which uses a high pressure jumper line. So we have inside the head, we have two fuel rails. We have what we consider a low pressure because it could only be up to 50, 60 psi. And we also have a return line. So in these systems here, fuel is also used to cool the injector. So when the injector is in the open phase, fuel can run through this injector and go out the return back to the tank to help keep that injector cool. We've talked about fuel tanks again, how we have them set up, why we have vents, why we have a drain. And again, one of the reasons fuel tanks should never be covered in the summertime is if fuel exceeds 90 degrees Fahrenheit, all the lighter ends are going to evaporate. Remember, we talked about VOCs, and those are the lighter ends that we need to ignite the fuel to start the burn process. Another thing to look at is fuel tank senders. How many times the customers come in and his fuel tanks read that they're fine, and he's run out of fuel or really close. So these, again, they're pretty standard on how they work. They just may vary in appearance. We talked about primary and secondary filters. Most systems have a primary and a secondary. The primary is on the suction side, secondary is on the pressure side. The other thing we might see on a primary filter is a water separator. So we might see a glass or a plexiglass container that we can see any water that's in there. And remember, diesel fuel is lighter than water, so water will always sink to the bottom. So some of these water separators also have a sensor, a WIF sensor, WIF, water in the fuel sensor. And they will trigger a light in the cab if it detects water in the fuel. We talked about different types of pumps earlier. Again, a diaphragm pump is around 7 psi. Plunger is 40 to 60 psi. Gear pumps can be, again, anything that they want because there's a relief valve in the gear pumps. When we take a look at the high pressure system, so this is a 6-cylinder inline injection pump. So these are all set up. One jumper line for each injector, and the injectors are into the cylinder heads. And then off of that, we have a bleed line. And again, this vent bleed line, any fuel that bypasses the injector gets returned either back to the system or back into the fuel tank. Now, one of the things that we have on these injection pumps is a restrictor valve. And all it is a spring and a ball. And it just keeps a little bit of pressure in the fuel gallery that's in the top here. So fuel comes in, and this one here prevents it from just leaking out. Different types of injectors that we're going to take a look at. So nozzle injectors, again, these use high pressure jumper lines. This one here, the plunger, has an extra lobe on the cam, which moves this up and down, and this is what creates the high pressure to atomize the fuel. And then we have an electronic version, and it does the same thing. We have off of the cam, we have an injector push rod that moves the plunger up and down that creates the fluid. What does the electronic part do? Well, the electronic part blocks off the return flow of fuel. We talked about fuel flowing through the head. Well, what happens when this plunger starts to move down? If the ECM says it's time to inject fuel, it'll block off the return side. The fuel can't return anywhere, it creates pressure, and it's got to come out the nozzle. So those are the different types of systems that we're going to take a look at in the next couple of weeks. And that's it for basic fuel injection.